hopefully you can all see me and hear me, and a huge thank you for inviting me to do this talk. And I'm going to be talking about inequalities in education, but I thought I'd start with having a look at the inequalities in education achievement that we see in the pre-COVID period in the UK to illustrate some of the points that I'm making. These trends that we see in the UK in terms of inequalities are mirrored in most education systems, certainly in the developed world. So the first point to make is that almost every education system that you look at, you see large gaps in education achievement by socioeconomic background, with obviously poorer students having far lower levels of attainment. The other important thing is that the gaps in their academic achievement emerge very early. In fact, as early as you can measure them, we see gaps as early as age 3. And those gaps in cognitive achievement, in academic achievement, widen as they go through the school system. There's very important work also by Cunha and Heckman, which shows that investment in developing those cognitive skills is complementary through time. And what that implies is, of course, that an early investment in children's education and children's skills tends to not only reap benefits because you're making the investment, but also it makes it easier for children to learn at a more rapid rate later on in their schooling. If you turn that on its head, as we might have to during the COVID crisis, and say what happens when children miss out on schooling, in other words, the investment in their schooling goes down because they're out of school or doing remote schooling, what's likely to happen? Well, you get the reverse effect, which is that children who fall behind find it then disproportionately hard to catch up. And I thought it might be useful just to illustrate what I've been saying with some data for the UK, although as I said, this picture would be quite similar across a number of countries. So what this shows you from left to right on the x-axis is the age of the child or young person as they go through the school system. And it's an assessment of the average percentile ranking of the wealthiest children from the wealthiest households, which is the red line, compared to children from the poorest fifth of households, which is the blue line at the bottom. And the height of the bars give you some visual indication of the achievement gap between the richest and the poorest fifth of households. And you can see that the gap is substantial in terms of a percentile ranking gap at age 7, and it's growing through time, right through to age 16, 18. And so what this indicates is that the poorer students in our system tend to fall behind early, and it's extremely difficult for them to catch up. And quite the contrary, what tends to happen is that the gap increases. So what does that mean when we think about the context that we're in at the moment with the pandemic? So in most countries, schools have been shut to differing degrees. Schools may be physically shut, but learning may still be happening because a lot of schools have shifted to what was called remote learning. But the quality and the provision in that remote learning varies hugely. So the learning loss is going to be very substantial for some children at least. And work I'm doing with a Royal Society initiative and Simon Burgess is trying to quantify the learning loss that we expect some children to have. On average, we might expect that 3 months of either no schooling or remote schooling would result in test scores being about 6% of a standard deviation lower. And that's basically more or less 2 months of learning that might be lost there. So in other words, we're thinking that children are going to suffer a fairly big hit from being in remote schooling. But the problem really is not so much that on average, children will experience learning loss, but it's that some children are going to experience far more loss than others. And I think this is really important when we're thinking about inequalities. So why do we think that the lockdown and the shift to remote schooling is going to widen inequalities? Well, we have evidence from the pre-COVID period that can help us on this. The first thing is that household income causally impacts on student achievement. We know children in households with higher levels of income do better in terms of their achievement. And even in the very short term, the impact of COVID has been to reduce household incomes. So some students are going to experience that. But more crucially, perhaps, than the immediate hit to short-term income, what we do see is that children in lower income households over a long period of time really struggle in terms of improving their achievement. And it's that group that we're going to be most worried about. And that group, when systems shifted to remote schooling, are getting far fewer inputs. In other words, the resources that each child is experiencing or receiving during this period is varying hugely according to the household income. And in particular, the time that parents have to spend with children, the knowledge they bring to bear when they do spend time trying to homeschool, and of course, the money they have to buy additional resources or laptops or other extracurricular materials. So these resources vary hugely across the different households. And there's evidence coming in from the Education Endowment Foundation, which has done a sort of rapid review on this, suggesting a number of things. Firstly, that the experience of children is wildly varying according to which school they're attending and their socioeconomic background. And the range in the number of hours of, for example, contact time that they're receiving from their school is quite dramatic. And their best estimate is that the gap between the richest and poorest students is likely to increase by 1/3 as a result of the lockdown. Now, this is all very uncertain. We don't have concrete data on this yet. We will soon. This is just on the basis of what we've seen previously. So the other thing that we're going to really see in the education system over the next few years is the students trying to make their way out of compulsory schooling, either into the next phase of education or into the labour market. They're going to struggle. So if we start with low-income students making the way into further and higher education. So in normal years, students from low-income households are anyway far less likely to go on to university, for example. But when they do go on to university, the other situation they face is that they are constrained. They're credit constrained, and the support they get from the state is not sufficient to support them during their higher education, particularly if they move away from home. So what most students from low-income backgrounds do or have to do is obviously work during their higher education studies. And what we're seeing as a result of COVID and the lockdown is that students are disproportionately working in the sectors that are hardest hit, retail, leisure, etc. And those sectors, if they remain depressed, are likely to have far fewer jobs available for students to support themselves during higher education. So there's going to be this immediate crunch where a poorer student might well decide that they can't make that transition to further or higher education because they can't afford to live while they go and study. The other situation that students are going to be facing is that if they're trying to leave the education system and get into the labour market, it's obviously going to be very difficult. The next few years, there's, I think, universal agreement that the unemployment rate, and particularly the youth unemployment rate, is going to rise. If we take evidence from previous recessions, it does tend to be those who haven't entered the labour market that find it most difficult to secure their first job, their first position. And on top of that, we know that those who are most at risk of experiencing this long spell of unemployment are those with lower levels of skill. The other thing we know from previous recessions, including the Great Recession, is that the scarring effects from an early spell of long unemployment can last for a very long time, certainly up to a decade after graduating. So in other words, we've got cohorts of young people trying to exit the education system, experiencing a long spell of unemployment, and then if they do secure work, getting lower quality, low paid work, and really struggling to make the transitions after that would get them back on the trajectory that they might have expected to have if they hadn't been trying to graduate into such a bad labour market. The only point I'd add on that is that graduates are very unlikely to be immune from these problems. There is a sense that the low-skilled non-graduate group is clearly going to be most at risk, particularly of unemployment. But the work that we've done on graduate earnings would suggest that they're certainly not going to be immune. And I just illustrate that again with some data from some research that we've done for the UK. So what this picture is showing is the earnings wage premium of male graduates split out by subject. So along the x-axis, you have the different degree subjects that you can take. And this is for bachelor's, for first degrees. The blue line shows the zero wage premium. So if you're sitting on that line, there is no wage benefit from taking a degree in that subject. Obviously, if a dot is above the line, then you have a positive wage premium from that subject. If a dot is below the line, a negative premium. And I'll just explain the difference between the black and the red dots. So the black dots are the raw differences in wages between a graduate in that subject and a non-graduate. So if you go to the far right-hand side of the picture, you can see economics and medicine. And what they're suggesting is that the earnings of economics graduates and medical graduates are about 80% or more than 80% higher than a non-graduate. But of course, there are lots of reasons why graduates may earn more. They may have higher cognitive ability, for example. And so what we would like to do is compare otherwise quite similar individuals. So the red dots come from a conditional regression, which allows for lots of other factors that influence people's earnings, including some measures of their prior achievement or their prior ability. And when we do that, the wage premium come down because some of that wage premium is just because graduates are different people. But what we also see is that the red dots clearly indicate wide variation in graduate earnings by subject. Again, up the right-hand side, you've got economics and medicine performing strongly. But if you look at the left-hand side of the picture, you'll see that even in pre-COVID days, this is a pre-COVID picture, we've got creative arts, communications, English graduates earning less than non-graduates, or certainly no more than graduates. And what that implies is very limited demand for those types of skill in the labour market as it was pre-COVID. And one would imagine that those graduates whose skills and degrees were not in strong demand even before COVID are going to struggle the most when it comes to thinking about getting jobs in a post-COVID situation. So what should we do about this? Obviously, the first thing, given the evidence on the importance of early investment in children's learning, we need to mitigate learning losses that have emerged. One way to do that is obviously to get schools open again, subject to health risks. The other is to think about one-to-one and small group interventions to try and mitigate some of that loss. We also need to think about a human capital strategy where we're increasing state subsidies where their market failure is really evident. For example, we don't want students deciding not to go to university because of a short-run credit constraint because they can't find a job to support themselves. So if there is that market failure, we need to fix that to make sure that students can continue to invest in their human capital where appropriate. We might also want to increase our investment in human capital overall, but we'd want to focus obviously where the social return, the social benefits exceed the private. And obviously in this pandemic, we can think of specific occupations, whether it's nursing or medicine, etc., where the social returns are very high indeed. And it might be that we want to increase our investment in that in order to encourage more to follow that particular route. And then finally, what we need to be thinking about is trying to minimize the scarring effects for those who are trying to enter the labour market during this recession. And one way to do that, of course, is to shelter the youth from the labour market altogether. In other words, to try and keep them in the education system rather than continuing to let them to try to enter a labour market unsuccessfully. But if we're going to shelter them in education, it's really important that they're investing in the kinds of human capital and skills that are likely to be valuable in the labour market. And obviously, if we are going to follow that route, we want to pay particular attention to the lower skilled who are at greatest risk of unemployment and permanent scarring from this COVID crisis. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.